There is a moment you don't talk about. It doesn't happen in public. It doesn't come with noise, applause, or a dramatic turning point. It happens quietly. Usually, when you're tired. When things aren't working. When you've tried enough times to realize something uncomfortable. No one is coming. No one is going to suddenly appear with the perfect advice, the perfect opportunity, the perfect push that finally changes everything for you. And for most people, that realization feels heavy. It feels like loss, like abandonment. But for a small number of people, that moment becomes the beginning of power. Because what looks like the absence of support is actually the removal of illusion. You start to see clearly. All this time, you thought your progress depended on motivation from others. You thought you needed encouragement, validation, recognition, something external to keep you moving. But the truth is far more uncomfortable and far more liberating. Anything that depends on external energy will always be unstable. Because people are inconsistent. Their attention shifts. Their priorities change. Their support fades. And if your direction depends on them, your life will always feel uncertain. This is where most people get stuck. They wait. They wait for clarity. They wait for confidence. They wait for someone to notice them, guide them, believe in them. And while they wait, time moves. Opportunities disappear. Potential slowly gets buried under hesitation. And a quiet frustration begins to grow, not because they aren't capable, but because they never fully stepped into that capability. But there is another path. A path that doesn't rely on timing, approval, or perfect conditions. A path where your progress doesn't rise and fall based on how supported you feel. That path is what we call winning alone. Not in the sense of isolation, not in the sense of rejecting people or disconnecting from the world, but in the sense of becoming so internally stable, so psychologically self-sufficient, that your movement forward no longer depends on external permission. You don't stop valuing people. You stop depending on them for your foundation. You stop outsourcing your confidence. You stop borrowing motivation. You stop waiting for someone else to activate your life. And instead, you begin building something internal, something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. Because real strength is never loud. It's not built in moments where everything feels easy. It's built in resistance, in the moments where doubt creeps in, where no one is watching, where there is no reward yet, and you still choose to continue. That's where identity is formed. That's where self-trust is built. That's where you stop being controlled by circumstances and start becoming the one who shapes them. Most people never reach this point, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack opportunity, but because they never fully detach from the need to be supported. They are always looking outward for something that was supposed to be built inward. They want certainty before action. They want validation before commitment. They want reassurance before risk. But life doesn't work that way. Clarity comes after movement. Confidence comes after repetition. Strength comes after resistance. And the people who understand this, the ones who quietly separate themselves, are not the loudest, not the most visible, not the most praised. They are simply the most internally anchored. They have learned how to sit with discomfort without collapsing, how to make decisions without consensus, how to continue without applause. They've built a relationship with themselves that doesn't break under pressure, and that changes everything. Because when you no longer depend on the world to feel stable, you start moving differently. You take action faster. You recover quicker. You think clearer. You become dangerous in the best possible way. Not because you overpower others, but because you are no longer easily shaken. This audiobook is not about becoming isolated. It's about becoming independent. It's about building a mind that doesn't crumble when support disappears, a system that keeps you moving when motivation fades, a standard that doesn't shift based on opinion. It's about learning how to rely on something that cannot be taken away from you, yourself. Because once you reach that point, once your foundation is internal, you don't just survive without support, you thrive without it. And ironically, that's when the world starts responding to you differently. Because people can feel it. They can sense when someone is no longer seeking approval, no longer chasing validation, no longer waiting to be chosen. They see someone who has already chosen themselves, and that energy is rare. It attracts opportunity. It commands respect. It creates momentum. But it all begins in the same place. That quiet moment. The one where you realize no one is coming. And instead of feeling defeated, you decide to rise. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. You might be surprised to find someone listening from the same place as you. Chapter 1. Nobody is coming to rescue you. That statement sounds harsh at first, almost cold. But if you sit with it long enough, you begin to realize it is not a punishment. It is permission. Because the moment you fully accept that no one is coming to save you, you stop waiting. And the moment you stop waiting, you start moving. Most people don't fail because they lack ability. They fail because they stay in a permanent state of anticipation. They are always preparing, always thinking, always hoping that something external will finally align. A better opportunity, a better mentor, a better version of themselves. But while they are waiting for perfect conditions, they are slowly giving away their power. Because every time you believe someone else is responsible for activating your life, you unconsciously position yourself as passive. You become a spectator in your own story. And that is the real danger. Not failure, not mistakes, but passivity. Because passivity feels safe, but it quietly destroys potential. You don't notice it immediately. It looks like being patient. It feels like waiting for the right time. It sounds like, I just need a little more clarity. But underneath all of it is avoidance. Avoidance of responsibility. Avoidance of risk. Avoidance of stepping into full ownership of your life. And ownership is where everything changes. Because the moment you take full responsibility, not just for your wins, but for everything, your mindset shifts completely. You stop blaming circumstances. You stop blaming timing. You stop blaming other people. And more importantly, you stop seeing yourself as someone who is affected by life and start seeing yourself as someone who shapes it. This is not about control over everything. You cannot control every outcome. You cannot predict every obstacle, but you can control one thing that matters more than all of it: your response, your standards, your effort, your consistency. And when you fully own those, you reclaim your authority. Most people only take partial responsibility. They claim their successes, but they distance themselves from their failures. They say, I did well because I worked hard. But when things go wrong, it becomes, the situation wasn't right. People didn't support me. I got unlucky. And that split thinking keeps them stuck. Because you cannot grow from something you refuse to own. True power begins when you take responsibility for everything. The good, the bad, the wasted time, the missed opportunities. Not to punish yourself, but to take back control. Because when everything is your responsibility, everything becomes changeable. You are no longer at the mercy of circumstances. You become the source. This is where emotional self-sufficiency begins. Because dependency is not always obvious. It's not just about needing people physically. It's about needing them emotionally, needing someone to encourage you before you act, needing validation before you decide, needing reassurance before you move forward. And when that support disappears, so does your momentum. That is not strength. That is conditional functioning. It means your progress is tied to something unstable, and anything unstable cannot sustain long-term growth. The people who learn to win alone understand something different. They build from within. They don't wait to feel ready. They don't wait to feel supported. They act, and then build the feeling afterward. They learn how to generate their own clarity through action, their own confidence through repetition, their own stability through discipline. And over time, something powerful happens. They begin to trust themselves, not in a loud, arrogant way, but in a quiet, grounded certainty. They know that even if things go wrong, they can handle it. Even if support disappears, they can continue. Even if no one believes in them, they can still believe in themselves. That kind of self-trust cannot be given to you. It cannot be taught through words alone. It is built through experience, through moments where you had no choice but to rely on yourself, and you did. Through decisions you made without approval and survived. Through challenges you faced without support and overcame. Each of those moments becomes evidence. Evidence that you are capable. Evidence that you are resilient. Evidence that you don't need to be rescued. And once you have enough of that evidence, your identity begins to change. You no longer see yourself as someone who needs saving. You see yourself as someone who handles things, someone who adapts, someone who figures it out. And that identity shift is everything, because identity drives behavior. If you believe you are dependent, you will act dependent. If you believe you are capable, you will act capable. So, the question is not whether help exists. Of course it does. There will always be people who support you, who guide you, who offer value. But the difference is this: do you need it, or do you choose it? Because when you need it, you become attached. When you choose it, you remain in control. You can receive help without depending on it. You can learn from others without surrendering your authority. That is real independence. And it begins with small decisions. Stop asking for advice on things you already know. Stop delaying action because you're waiting for reassurance. Stop looking for permission to do what you already feel is right. Instead, start acting. Start deciding. Start trusting your own evaluation. At first, it will feel uncomfortable because you are breaking a pattern. You are moving from dependency to self-direction. And that transition always comes with uncertainty. But stay with it, because on the other side of that discomfort is freedom. Freedom from needing approval. Freedom from waiting. Freedom from hesitation. And in that freedom, you discover something most people never fully experience. You realize that the strength you were looking for was always available. You just kept giving it away. Now you take it back. Chapter 2. Most people are playing a game they don't even realize they're losing. Not because they lack effort, not because they lack intelligence, but because they're measuring themselves using the wrong system. They are living by a scoreboard they did not design. A scoreboard controlled by other people. How many likes? How much recognition? How much approval? How impressive they appear from the outside. And because that scoreboard is external, it is unstable. One day you feel ahead. The next day you feel behind. One moment you feel confident. The next moment you question everything. Not because you changed, but because the scoreboard changed. And that is the trap. Because when your sense of progress depends on external metrics, you lose control over your own perception of success. You become emotionally reactive to things you don't control. And over time, that creates inconsistency. You work hard, but feel empty. You improve, but don't feel it. You achieve, but it never feels like enough. This is why so many people burn out, not because they're doing too much, but because they're measuring the wrong things. The people who learn to win alone understand something deeper. They stop playing to the public scoreboard, and they build their own. A personal measurement system, private, internal, unshakable. This system is not based on how things look. It's based on how things are. Did you show up today when you didn't feel like it? Did you follow through on what you said you would do? Did you act in alignment with your values? Did you improve, even slightly? These are not visible metrics. No one applauds them. No one gives you recognition for them. But they are the only metrics that actually build a life, because they are within your control, and control creates stability. When you shift from external measurement to internal measurement, your entire experience changes. You no longer need constant feedback to stay motivated. You no longer feel lost when recognition disappears. You become consistent, because your standard is consistent. This is what psychologists describe as an internal locus of control. But beyond the terminology, it is simply this. You become the one who defines your progress, not the world. And that shift is powerful, because it removes emotional volatility. When your value is tied to external feedback, you are constantly fluctuating. Praise lifts you up. Criticism pulls you down. You are not stable. You are reactive. But when your value is tied to your own standards, you become steady. You know when you did well. You know when you didn't. And more importantly, you don't need anyone else to confirm it. This is where real confidence begins. Not from compliments, not from validation, but from alignment. Alignment between what you say and what you do. Between your standards and your actions, between your values and your behavior. That alignment creates a quiet certainty, a grounded sense of self that doesn't depend on attention. And that is what most people are actually searching for, without realizing it. They think they want recognition, but what they really want is confirmation that they are moving in the right direction. And when you build your own measurement system, you give that to yourself. You don't need to wait for someone else to notice. You already know. This also changes how you experience results, because external scoreboards focus on outcomes. Did you win? Did you succeed? Did you achieve the result? But outcomes are not always within your control. You can do everything right and still not see immediate results. And if your entire system depends on outcomes, you will lose motivation during those periods. You will feel like you are failing, even when you are progressing. But an internal system focuses on process. Did you execute? Did you stay disciplined? Did you maintain your standards? These are things you control. And when you focus on them, you always have access to progress, even when results are delayed. This is what allows certain people to stay consistent while others quit, not because they are more motivated, but because they are measuring differently. They find satisfaction in the process. They see growth where others see stagnation. They understand that what is invisible today becomes undeniable later. And because of that, they keep going. There is also another layer to this. Your internal scorecard protects you from comparison, from distraction, from losing yourself. Because once you define your own standards, you stop chasing other people's paths. You stop measuring your life against timelines that were never meant for you. You stop feeling behind, simply because someone else is ahead in a different race. You begin to focus on your path, your growth, your direction. And that focus compounds, because energy that was once scattered becomes concentrated. You move faster. You think clearer. You execute better. All because you are no longer trying to win someone else's game. You are playing your own. But building this system requires honesty, real honesty, not the kind where you justify your actions, not the kind where you avoid discomfort, but the kind where you look at yourself without distortion, where you can say, I didn't show up today. I avoided what I knew I needed to do. I lowered my standard. Not to judge yourself, but to correct yourself. Because your internal scorecard only works if it is truthful. If you lie to yourself, you destroy the system. But if you stay honest, you build something incredibly powerful. Self-respect. And self-respect is different from confidence. Confidence can fluctuate. Self-respect is earned. It is built through consistent alignment with your own standards. And once you have it, you don't want to lose it. So you show up again. You stay disciplined again. You keep your word again, not for recognition, but because that is who you are becoming. And over time, that identity solidifies. You are no longer someone trying to improve. You are someone who operates at a higher standard. And that changes everything. Because when your identity changes, your behavior becomes automatic. You don't need motivation to act. You act because it is consistent with who you are. This is why the internal scorecard is so powerful. It doesn't just track your progress. It shapes your identity. It turns effort into consistency, consistency into discipline, and discipline into character. And once that character is built, no external system can shake it. Because your foundation is no longer outside, it is within. And when that happens, you stop chasing validation. You start creating results. Chapter 3. Most people misunderstand motivation. They think it's something you either have or you don't. Something that appears when you feel inspired and disappears when you don't. So they wait for it. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel energized. They wait to feel certain. And while they wait, nothing moves. This is why so many people stay stuck. Not because they lack desire, but because they are dependent on a feeling that is inherently unstable. Motivation, when it comes from the outside, is temporary. It rises when something excites you. It fades when reality becomes difficult. It depends on circumstances, on mood, on environment, and anything that depends on those variables cannot sustain long-term progress. The people who learn to win alone understand a different truth. Motivation is not something you wait for. It is something you generate from within. And that changes everything. Because when you no longer rely on external triggers, you become consistent. You don't need the perfect environment. You don't need constant encouragement. You don't need to feel good before you act. You act, and the feeling follows. This is the reversal most people never make. They believe, I need to feel motivated. Then I will take action. But the reality is the opposite. You take action, then motivation appears. Because action creates momentum, and momentum creates energy. Think about it. There have been moments where you didn't feel like doing something. But once you started, it became easier. Your focus sharpened. Your resistance faded. Your energy increased. That wasn't coincidence. That was the natural response of your system to movement. But if you never start, you never access that state. You stay in resistance. You stay in hesitation. You stay in a loop of thinking without doing. And over time, that loop becomes your identity. Someone who wants to, but doesn't. Breaking that pattern requires a shift from emotional dependency to internal generation. Because self-motivation is not about feeling excited. It's about knowing how to create energy even when you don't feel like it. And that begins with purpose, not surface-level goals, but deeper alignment. Why does this matter to you? Who are you becoming through this? What kind of life are you building? If your actions are disconnected from meaning, your motivation will always fade, because there is nothing holding it in place. But when your actions are connected to something deeper, something internal, something identity-based, you don't need constant reminders. The drive becomes steady, not intense, but consistent. And consistency is more powerful than intensity, because intensity burns out. Consistency compounds. This is where most people go wrong. They chase high-energy states. They want to feel inspired, excited, unstoppable. But those states are temporary, and when they disappear, so does their progress. The ones who move forward consistently are not the most excited. They are the most disciplined. They understand that motivation is not about how you feel. It's about what you do, regardless of how you feel. They have learned to act when they are tired, to show up when they are distracted, to continue when they are uncertain. And in doing so, they build something far more valuable than motivation. They build reliability. They become someone who can be counted on, not by others, but by themselves. And that is where real power comes from. Because when you trust yourself to act, you stop negotiating with your emotions. You don't ask, "Do I feel like it?" You ask, "Is this what needs to be done?" And if the answer is yes, you move. That shift eliminates hesitation. It removes the internal debate. It creates clarity, and clarity reduces resistance. Another key element of self-motivation is feedback. Most people rely on external feedback to stay engaged. They need recognition. They need results. They need confirmation. But when that feedback is delayed, they lose momentum. So the solution is simple. You create your own. You track your progress. You acknowledge your effort. You recognize your improvement privately, without needing anyone else to validate it. Because progress is happening, whether it is seen or not. And when you learn to see it yourself, you remove the dependency. You no longer need applause to continue. You continue because you know you are moving forward. This creates a loop. Action to progress, to internal recognition, to more action, a self-sustaining system. And once that system is built, you become unstoppable in a quiet way. Not because you are always motivated, but because you no longer need to be. There is also a deeper layer to this: your relationship with your future self. Most people are disconnected from it. They think about the future abstractly, as something distant, as something optional. So their present actions feel meaningless. But when you build a clear connection, when you can see who you are becoming, when you understand what your current actions are building toward, everything changes. You are no longer acting for immediate results. You are acting for alignment. You are acting for identity. You are acting for the version of yourself that does not yet exist, but is being created with every decision. And that creates responsibility, because now your actions matter, not just for today, but for who you become. And when you feel that, You don't need motivation. You have direction. And direction is stronger. Because motivation fluctuates. Direction stays. This also changes how you view difficulty. Most people interpret resistance as a signal to stop. It's hard. Maybe this isn't right. But those who generate their own drive see it differently. They understand that difficulty is not a warning. It is confirmation. Confirmation that you are growing, that you are stretching, that you are building capacity. So instead of retreating, they lean in. They use resistance as fuel. They convert friction into momentum. And that mindset allows them to continue when others quit. Because they are not trying to avoid difficulty. They are using it. And over time, this builds something deeper than motivation. It builds endurance, the ability to continue without needing constant reward, the ability to persist without immediate results, the ability to stay focused without external pressure. And that is rare, because most people are conditioned to respond to reward, to act when they feel good, to stop when they don't. But when you break that pattern, you gain an advantage. You become someone who moves, regardless of conditions. And that is the definition of internal power. So the goal is not to always feel motivated. The goal is to become someone who can create movement. Without it, someone who acts first and lets motivation follow. Someone who builds systems instead of relying on feelings. Because once you reach that point, you are no longer waiting for energy. You are generating it. And that changes the game completely. Chapter 4. Most people believe their emotions are reactions, something that happens to them, a result of circumstances, people, situations. If things go well, they feel good. If things go wrong, they feel bad. It seems logical. But this way of living creates a hidden dependency. Because if your emotional state depends on external conditions, then your stability is never truly yours. It belongs to whatever is happening around you, to how people treat you, to what results you get, to what others say or don't say. And that means your internal world is constantly shifting, unpredictable, reactive, vulnerable. This is where most people live. They don't realize it, but their emotional state is outsourced. They are not regulating themselves. They are being regulated by the environment. And that is why they feel inconsistent. Confident one day, doubtful the next, focused in one moment, distracted in another. Not because they lack strength, but because they never built it internally. The people who learn to win alone develop something different. They take ownership of their emotional state, not in the sense of suppressing feelings, not in the sense of pretending everything is fine, but in the sense of understanding. I am responsible for how I respond to what I feel. That distinction changes everything, because emotions are real. They arise automatically. Fear, doubt, frustration, loneliness. You cannot stop them from appearing, but you can decide what happens next. You can decide whether you are controlled by them or whether you move through them. Most people never develop that ability. They react immediately. They feel doubt and stop. They feel fear and retreat. They feel discomfort and escape. And over time, that pattern becomes their default. Emotion to reaction to reinforcement. They don't even question it. It feels natural. But it is not strength. It is conditioning. And breaking that conditioning begins with awareness. You have to start noticing your emotional patterns. When do you lose focus? What triggers your insecurity? What situations cause you to hesitate? Not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself. Because you cannot control what you don't recognize. Once you see the pattern, you create space. And that space is power. Because in that space, you have a choice. You can follow the old reaction, or you can respond differently. At first, that choice feels small, almost insignificant, but it is not, because every time you choose your response consciously, you weaken the old pattern, and over time, you build a new one. This is emotional self-regulation, the ability to feel without being controlled, to experience without being overwhelmed, to remain steady even when things are unstable. And that stability is what creates independence, because now your state is not dependent on outcomes. You can feel uncertainty and still act. You can feel fear and still move forward. You can feel doubt and still stay consistent. That is real strength. Not the absence of emotion, but the ability to function despite it. There is also a deeper shift that happens here. You stop taking things personally, because most emotional reactions come from interpretation. Someone criticizes you, and you interpret it as rejection. Someone ignores you, and you interpret it as disrespect. Something doesn't work out, and you interpret it as failure. But those interpretations are not always accurate. They are filtered through your past experiences, beliefs, and insecurities. And when you treat them as truth, you react to something that may not even be real. This is why emotional ownership matters, because it forces you to question, what am I actually feeling? Why am I feeling this? Is this reaction helping me or limiting me? That questioning breaks automatic responses. It creates clarity, and clarity reduces emotional intensity. You begin to see things differently. Not everything is about you. Not every outcome defines you. Not every setback is a reflection of your worth. And once you see that, you become less reactive, more stable, more grounded. Another important aspect is learning to sit with discomfort. Most people avoid it. They distract themselves. They escape into entertainment. They seek immediate relief because discomfort feels wrong. But discomfort is not the problem. Avoidance is. Because every time you avoid discomfort, you reinforce the belief that you cannot handle it. And that belief weakens you. But when you stay with it, when you allow yourself to feel without escaping, something changes. You realize it doesn't destroy you. You realize it passes. You realize you are stronger than the feeling itself. And that realization builds confidence. Not surface-level confidence, but deep, internal confidence. The kind that comes from experience. From knowing that no matter what you feel, you can handle it. This also applies to loneliness. Many people fear being alone, not because they need people, but because they are uncomfortable with themselves, with their thoughts, with their emotions. So they constantly seek distraction. But when you develop emotional ownership, you become comfortable in your own presence. You don't need constant stimulation. You don't need constant validation. You can be alone without feeling empty. And that changes your relationships. Because now, you are not connecting out of need. You are connecting out of choice. You are not seeking to be completed. You are already whole. And that makes your interactions stronger, more genuine, more balanced. You give without depending. You receive without attaching. That is emotional independence. It does not isolate you. It strengthens you. Because now, your emotional state is yours, not controlled by outcomes, not dictated by others, but guided by your awareness and your response. And that gives you consistency. Because when your emotions are stable, your actions become stable. You stop quitting based on how you feel. You stop delaying based on uncertainty. You stop reacting based on impulse. Instead, you operate from clarity, from intention, from control. And that is what allows you to move forward, even when things are not perfect, because they never will be. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be discomfort. There will always be moments where you feel off. But those moments no longer stop you, because you are no longer dependent on feeling good to function. You have built something stronger, the ability to feel and still move. Chapter 5. Most people rely on motivation. That's the problem. They wake up and ask themselves how they feel. They wait for energy. They wait for clarity. And when those things are not there, nothing happens. This creates inconsistency. You move forward on good days. You fall back on bad ones. You make progress, then lose it. You build momentum, then break it. Not because you lack discipline, but because you are relying on something unstable. Motivation fluctuates. Systems do not. This is the shift from emotional dependence to structural reliability. The people who learn to win alone don't rely on how they feel. They build frameworks, invisible structures that carry them forward, even when they don't feel like moving. These frameworks remove friction. They eliminate decision fatigue. They reduce hesitation. They create direction. So instead of asking, "What should I do today?" you already know. You don't think. You execute. And that is powerful. Because every decision you remove frees up energy. Every routine you build creates consistency. And consistency is what produces results. Not intensity, not bursts of effort, but repeated structured action over time. This is why systems matter. Because they operate independently of mood. You can feel tired and still follow a system. You can feel distracted and still follow a system. You don't need to feel ready. You just need to follow the structure. And over time, that structure becomes automatic. It becomes part of your identity. You are no longer someone who tries. You are someone who operates. One of the most powerful frameworks you can build is your morning protocol. Because how you start your day sets the direction for everything that follows. Most people wake up reactively. They check their phone. They respond to messages. They consume information. And immediately, their mind is scattered. They have already given control away. But when you have a morning system, you start with intention. You anchor yourself first. It doesn't need to be complex. Movement, stillness, planning. What matters is consistency, because it creates a baseline, a mental state that is not dependent on external input. You begin the day centered, and that carries forward. The same applies to your evening. Most people end their day unconsciously. They drift into distraction. They avoid reflection. And as a result, they repeat the same patterns. But when you build an evening protocol, you close the loop. You review your day. What did you do well? Where did you fall short? What needs to improve? Not with judgment, but with awareness, because awareness creates correction, and correction creates growth. Over time, this daily reflection compounds. You improve faster. You adjust quicker. You become more intentional. Another key element of personal frameworks is tracking, not for perfection, but for visibility, because what you track, you become aware of, and what you are aware of, you can improve. You don't need complex systems. Simple is better. Did you follow through? Did you execute your priorities? Did you maintain your standard? These small check-ins create accountability, even when no one is watching. And that is the point. Because true discipline is private. It is what you do when there is no external pressure. when there is no recognition, when there is no reward yet. Frameworks allow you to maintain that discipline without needing motivation. They also reduce one of the biggest hidden drains of energy: decision fatigue. Every day, you make hundreds of small decisions. What to do, when to do it, how to do it. And each decision consumes energy. So, by the time you need to focus on something important, you are already depleted. But when you have systems, you eliminate unnecessary decisions. You know your priorities. You know your routine. You know your structure. And that preserves energy for execution, for focus, for progress. Another important aspect of frameworks is flexibility, because life is unpredictable. There will be days where things don't go as planned, and if your system is too rigid, you will break it, then abandon it. So instead, you build layers: a full version and a minimal version. On a perfect day, you execute everything. On a difficult day, you execute the essentials, but you never drop to zero, because consistency matters more than intensity. Even small action maintains momentum, and momentum is everything, because once momentum is lost, resistance increases. Starting again becomes harder. So your goal is simple: never stop completely. Even if progress is slow, keep it alive. This also applies to setbacks, because setbacks will happen. You will miss days. You will lose focus. You will break your routine. That is normal. But what matters is how quickly you return. Most people fall into a pattern. They miss one day, then feel like they failed, then stop completely. But people who operate through systems recover quickly. They don't overthink. They don't overanalyze. They simply return, because the system is still there, waiting. This reduces emotional attachment to failure. You don't see a missed day as failure. You see it as interruption, and interruption is temporary. This mindset keeps you consistent. It prevents small mistakes from becoming permanent setbacks. Over time, these frameworks build something deeper: trust, not in the system, in yourself. Because every time you follow through, you reinforce the belief: I do what I say, I will do. And that belief becomes your foundation. You no longer rely on motivation. You rely on structure. You rely on identity. You rely on consistency. And that creates stability. Because your progress is no longer dependent on how you feel. It is built into how you operate. That is the power of frameworks. They carry you when you don't feel like carrying yourself. They guide you when your mind feels unclear. They sustain you when motivation fades. And once they are in place, you stop relying on temporary states. You start building permanent systems. And that is what allows you to keep moving, no matter what. Chapter 6. Most people don't trust themselves. Not fully. They hesitate before making decisions. They second-guess their instincts. They look outward before they look inward. And it seems harmless. Asking for advice, getting opinions, seeking reassurance. But over time, this creates a quiet dependency. Because every time you defer to someone else, you weaken your own judgment. You train yourself to believe, I am not enough to decide. I need confirmation before I act. And that belief becomes a habit, a pattern of hesitation, a loop of doubt. The people who learn to win alone break that loop. They develop something rare: trust in their own judgment. Not because they are always right, but because they understand something deeper. It is better to live with your own decisions than to live by someone else's. Because your decisions teach you, they shape you, they refine your thinking, they build your awareness. But when you constantly rely on others, you lose that process. You avoid mistakes, but you also avoid growth. And without growth, you stay dependent. This is the paradox. Trying to avoid being wrong keeps you weak. Allowing yourself to decide, even imperfectly, makes you stronger. Because judgment is a skill, and like any skill, it improves through use. You don't develop it by thinking. You develop it by doing, by making choices, by observing outcomes, by reflecting and adjusting, over and over again. But most people interrupt that process. They seek input before acting. They poll opinions. They delay decisions. They try to eliminate uncertainty. But uncertainty is part of the process. You will never have complete information. You will never feel 100% certain. And waiting for that state leads to paralysis. So the shift is simple. From seeking certainty to building confidence in uncertainty. Because confidence is not knowing the outcome. It is trusting yourself to handle it, whatever it is. That is real confidence. And it comes from experience, from making decisions and surviving them, from choosing paths and adapting along the way, from realizing that even when things don't go as planned, you can recover. That realization changes everything. Because now, you are not afraid of being wrong. You are comfortable learning, and learning accelerates growth. Another key element of trusting your judgment is self-knowledge, because decisions are not just about logic. They are about alignment. What matters to you? What do you value? What kind of life are you building? If you don't know these things, every decision feels confusing. Because you have no internal filter, you are trying to decide based on external noise, other people's opinions, other people's standards, other people's expectations, and that leads to conflict. But when you understand yourself, decisions become clearer, not easier, but clearer. Because you have criteria. You can ask, does this align with who I am becoming? Does this move me forward or distract me? Is this based on fear or intention? These questions simplify decisions. They cut through noise. They bring you back to your own path. And that builds trust. Because now, your decisions are not random. They are intentional. Another obstacle people face is fear of disapproval. They worry about what others will think. They hesitate because their choices might not be accepted. So they adjust. They compromise. They choose what is safe instead of what is right for them. But this comes at a cost, because every time you choose approval over alignment, you betray yourself, and that weakens your confidence. Because deep down, you know you didn't choose honestly. So trust in your judgment requires courage. The courage to be misunderstood, the courage to be different, the courage to choose your path, even when others don't agree. And that is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because your life is not meant to make sense to everyone. It is meant to make sense to you. Another important distinction is this: seeking advice versus seeking approval. They are not the same. Seeking advice means gathering information, learning perspectives, expanding your understanding, but you still decide. Seeking approval means outsourcing the decision, letting someone else validate it or reject it. And that weakens you because you are no longer in control. So the goal is not to ignore others. It is to filter, to listen, but not depend, to consider, but not surrender, to decide for yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are the one who lives with the outcome. You are the one who experiences the consequences. So your judgment matters more than anyone else's. And the more you practice, the stronger it becomes. You start with small decisions. what to do with your time, how to structure your day, what to prioritize. You stop asking for input on everything. You begin to rely on your own evaluation. And over time, your confidence grows, not because you are always right, but because you trust your ability to adjust. You trust your ability to learn. You trust your ability to navigate. And that trust creates speed. You stop overthinking. You stop delaying. You make decisions and move. And that movement creates progress. Because clarity often comes from action, not before it. So the more you act, the more clarity you gain. And the cycle continues. Action to feedback, to adjustment to growth. This is how strong judgment is built. Not in theory, in practice. And once you reach that level, something shifts internally. You feel grounded, not because everything is certain, but because you are. You know that no matter what decision you make, you will handle it. You will learn. You will adapt. You will continue. And that removes fear. Not completely, but enough to move forward. Because fear no longer stops you. It becomes part of the process. And when that happens, you become independent. Not from others, but from the need to rely on them. You can still listen, still learn, still grow. But you are no longer dependent. You are self-directed. And that is what allows you to move without hesitation. Chapter 7. The need for approval is one of the most invisible limitations you carry. It doesn't look like weakness. It looks like consideration. It looks like being thoughtful. It looks like wanting to be accepted. But underneath it is a quiet fear. The fear of being rejected. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of not being liked. And that fear shapes your behavior more than you realize. You adjust what you say. You soften what you want. You delay what you know you should do. Not because it's wrong, but because it might not be approved. This is how people lose themselves. Not all at once, but gradually. Decision by decision. Compromise by compromise. Until they are no longer living based on what they believe, but based on what will be accepted. And the problem with approval is that it is never stable. Even when you receive it, it doesn't last. People change their opinions. They shift their attention. They move on. So if your sense of direction depends on approval, your life will always feel uncertain. You will constantly adjust, constantly question, constantly seek confirmation. And that creates anxiety, because you are trying to control something you cannot control, other people's perception. The people who learn to win alone understand this early. They stop chasing approval, not because they don't care about people, but because they understand the cost. Approval often comes at the expense of authenticity. You say what people want to hear, instead of what is true. You choose what is safe, instead of what is aligned. You follow what is accepted, instead of what is right for you. And over time, that disconnect creates frustration, because you are living a life that looks correct, but doesn't feel right. This is why approval is so limiting. It keeps you within boundaries that were never meant for you, because growth requires friction. It requires doing things that others don't understand. It requires making choices that are not immediately accepted. If you need approval to move, you will avoid those moments. You will choose comfort over growth, acceptance over expansion, and that keeps you average. Breaking this pattern begins with awareness. You have to notice when you are seeking approval, when you hesitate because of what others might think, when you adjust your behavior to fit expectations, when you delay action because it might not be accepted, and once you see it, you can question it. Is this decision aligned with me, or aligned with their expectations? That question is powerful because it brings you back to yourself. It reminds you that your life is yours, not something to be approved by others. Another important realization is this: most people are not thinking about you as much as you think. They are focused on their own lives, their own problems, their own insecurities. And even when they do judge, it is often a reflection of their own limitations. Someone who is afraid to take risks will criticize your ambition. Someone who is comfortable staying the same will question your growth, not because you are wrong, but because your choices challenge their comfort. So their opinion is not truth, it is perspective. And once you understand that, it loses power. You stop taking it personally. You stop treating it as validation or rejection. You simply see it for what it is: input, not authority. This allows you to move freely, because you are no longer trying to control how you are perceived. You are focused on how you are living. Another shift happens when you stop seeking approval. You become selective. Not every opinion matters. Not every voice deserves your attention. You begin to filter. Whose opinion is based on experience? Whose perspective aligns with your values? Who actually understands your path? Those are the voices you consider. The rest, you acknowledge and release. Because listening to everyone creates confusion. It pulls you in different directions. It dilutes your focus. But when you are selective, you stay clear. You stay grounded. You stay aligned. There is also a deeper layer to this. Approval seeking is often rooted in identity. You want to be seen as good, as capable, as successful. So you act in ways that reinforce that image. But the problem is, you start performing. You become someone who looks right, instead of someone who is real. And performance is exhausting, because it requires constant maintenance, constant adjustment, constant awareness of how you are being perceived. But authenticity is different. It is stable, because it is not dependent on perception. It is based on truth. And when you operate from that place, you feel lighter. You feel clearer. You feel more in control, because you are no longer managing an image. You are simply being. This doesn't mean you ignore feedback. Constructive feedback is valuable. It helps you improve. It gives you perspective. But the difference is this: you use feedback. You don't depend on it. You listen, but you decide. You consider, but you choose. That keeps your authority intact. Because at the end of the day, your life is not a group decision. It is yours. And once you accept that, you stop needing permission. You stop waiting for approval. You stop asking if it's okay to move forward. You simply move. That is freedom. Not the absence of opinions, but the ability to act despite them. And when you reach that point, something interesting happens. You become more confident. Not loud confidence, not forced confidence, but a quiet certainty. Because you are no longer trying to be accepted. You are focused on being aligned. And alignment creates stability. You know what you stand for. You know what you value. You know where you are going. So even when others disagree, you are not shaken. Because your direction is internal. And that is what makes you strong. Because now, you are not controlled by approval. You are guided by intention. And that allows you to grow without limitation. Chapter 8. Most people are never truly alone, not because they are surrounded by people, but because they are constantly surrounded by noise, screens, voices, content, distractions. Every empty moment is filled. Every silence is avoided. And because of that, They never actually meet themselves. They never sit long enough to understand their own thoughts. Never stay still long enough to process their own emotions. Never disconnect long enough to hear their own direction. This is why solitude feels uncomfortable for so many people. Not because being alone is painful, but because they are unfamiliar with what they might find there. Their own mind, their own uncertainty, their own truth. So they escape, they scroll, they consume, they distract. And in doing so, they weaken something essential, their mental strength. Because strength is not built in constant stimulation. It is built in stillness, in the absence of noise, in the moments where there is nothing to rely on, except yourself. This is the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is passive. It is the feeling of lacking connection, of wanting something external. Solitude is intentional. It is the choice to be alone, to develop something internal. One drains you, the other builds you. But most people never make that distinction. They treat being alone as something to avoid, so they never access the benefits. And those benefits are profound. Because when you remove external input, your mind shifts. It moves from reactive to generative. Instead of responding to what you see, you begin to create your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own solutions, your own clarity. This is where real thinking happens, not in constant consumption, but in quiet reflection. You start connecting patterns, understanding yourself, processing experiences, and over time, this builds awareness, a deeper understanding of who you are, what you want, and where you are going. Without that awareness, you are easily influenced, pulled by trends, shaped by opinions, directed by external noise. But with it, you become grounded, because your direction is internal. Solitude also strengthens emotional control, because when you are alone, you cannot escape your feelings. There is no distraction, no immediate relief. You have to sit with what arises, and that builds capacity. You learn how to feel discomfort without reacting. You learn how to process emotions without escaping. You learn how to remain steady, even when things feel unstable. That is emotional strength, and it cannot be developed in constant distraction. It requires presence. It requires stillness. It requires time. Another powerful aspect of solitude is honesty. When you are around others, you are always aware of how you are perceived, of how you present yourself, even subtly. You adjust. But when you are alone, there is no performance, no image to maintain, no expectation to meet. You can see yourself clearly, your habits, your patterns, your thoughts, without distortion. And that honesty is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because you cannot improve what you refuse to see. Solitude creates that space. It removes the filters. It allows truth to surface. And once you see clearly, you can change, you can adjust, you can grow. This is why so many high-performing individuals value solitude, not as escape, but as a tool, a space to think, to reset, to reconnect. Because in that space, they regain clarity, and clarity drives better decisions, better focus, better execution. Solitude also builds independence, because when you are comfortable being alone, you are no longer driven by the need for constant connection. You don't seek people to avoid yourself. You engage with people by choice, and that changes the quality of your relationships. You are not dependent. You are selective. You don't stay in situations out of fear of being alone. You choose what aligns and walk away from what doesn't, because you are already complete. That is power, because now you are not controlled by loneliness. You are guided by intention. Another important shift happens in solitude. You develop your own voice. Without external input, your thoughts become clearer. Your perspective strengthens. You begin to trust your own ideas, your own direction, instead of constantly referencing others. And that builds confidence, not from validation, but from clarity. Because you know what you think, you know what you believe, you know what matters to you. And that makes decision-making easier. Because you are not overwhelmed by noise. You are anchored in your own perspective. But solitude is a skill. It is not something you master instantly. At first, it feels uncomfortable. Your mind races, you feel restless, you reach for distraction. That is normal, because you are breaking a pattern of constant stimulation. But if you stay with it, it changes. The discomfort fades, the noise settles, and something else emerges. Calm, clarity, focus. You begin to enjoy your own presence. You begin to value the silence. Because in that silence, you find something most people are missing. Stability, not based on external conditions, not dependent on others, but rooted within. And that stability carries into everything. Your work, your decisions, your relationships. Because you are no longer scattered, you are centered. And that allows you to operate differently. You think deeper. You act more intentionally. You react less impulsively. All because you have created space. Space to process. Space to understand. Space to grow. So solitude is not isolation. It is preparation. It is where you build the internal strength that allows you to function independently, to think clearly, to feel steadily, to act with intention. And once you develop that, you no longer fear being alone. You value it, because you know what it gives you, and that makes you stronger in every environment. Chapter 9. There is a habit that quietly drains your energy. And most people don't even realize they're doing it, explaining themselves over and over again. Why you chose this path, why you made that decision, why you're doing something different. At first, it feels reasonable. You want to be understood. You want people to see your perspective. You want to avoid conflict. But underneath it is something deeper. The need to justify your life, and that need is exhausting. Because not everyone is meant to understand you. Not everyone sees what you see. Not everyone values what you value. Not everyone is walking the path you are walking. So when you try to explain yourself to everyone, you end up doing something dangerous. You dilute your clarity. Because every time you explain, you open the door to doubt. Questions, criticism, conflicting opinions, and suddenly, something that felt clear to you starts to feel uncertain, not because it changed, but because you exposed it to perspectives that were never aligned with it. This is where many people lose momentum. They had a direction. They felt aligned. But after enough conversations, they start hesitating, second-guessing, reevaluating, and eventually stopping. Not because the path was wrong, but because they allowed too many voices into a decision that was never meant to be collective. The people who learn to win alone understand this. They stop explaining themselves to everyone, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. They recognize a simple truth. Understanding is not required for execution. You don't need everyone to agree with you to move forward. You don't need validation to take action. You don't need approval to continue. And once you accept that, you reclaim your focus. Because now, your energy is not spent on defending your choices. It is spent on building them. There is also another layer to this. Most people who question you are not actually seeking understanding. They are projecting their own perspective, their own limitations, their own fears, their own experiences. Someone who values stability will question your risk. Someone who fears change will doubt your growth. Someone who has settled will challenge your ambition. Not because you are wrong, but because your choices don't fit their framework. And when you try to explain yourself within their framework, you lose, because it was never designed for you. This is why over-explaining is dangerous. It forces you to translate your vision into a language that may not support it. And in doing so, you weaken it. You make it smaller, safer, more acceptable, but less true. So, the shift is simple. From explaining to executing. From defending to building. Because results don't need explanation. They speak for themselves. And the time you spend justifying is time you are not progressing. Another important distinction is this: sharing versus defending. Sharing is intentional. You communicate with people who are aligned, people who are curious, people who add value. Defending is reactive. You try to convince people who have already decided they don't agree. One creates clarity, the other creates resistance. So you choose carefully who you speak to, what you share, when you engage, because not every conversation is productive. Not every opinion is valuable. Not every person needs access to your vision. And protecting that protects your momentum. There is also a deeper psychological shift here. When you stop explaining yourself, you strengthen your self-trust, because you are no longer seeking validation. You are acting based on your own certainty, and that builds confidence, not from being understood, but from being aligned. You know why you are doing what you are doing. You know where you are going, and that is enough. This also requires comfort with being misunderstood, which is difficult because humans naturally want to be seen, to be understood. But growth often requires stepping outside of what others recognize. And when you do that, you will be misunderstood. That is part of the process. Not a sign that you are wrong, but a sign that you are moving beyond familiar patterns. So instead of resisting it, you accept it. You allow people to not fully understand. You allow them to question, to doubt, to disagree, without feeling the need to correct them. Because their understanding is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is your direction. This also helps you set boundaries. You no longer engage in every debate. You no longer justify every decision. You no longer feel obligated to respond to every opinion. You become selective. You conserve energy. And that energy is redirected into what actually matters: execution. Because at the end of the day, progress is not built through explanation. It is built through action. And action requires focus, not constant conversation. Another powerful realization is this: the people who truly matter don't require constant explanation. They may not fully understand your path, but they respect your right to walk it. They trust your judgment. They support your growth, even if it looks different from theirs. Those are the people you keep close, not because they agree with everything, but because they respect your autonomy. Everyone else is background noise. And once you treat it that way, your mind becomes clearer. Your direction becomes stronger. Your execution becomes faster, because you are no longer carrying the weight of needing to be understood by everyone. You are free. Free to move. Free to decide. Free to build, without constant justification. And that freedom creates momentum, because now, nothing is slowing you down. No unnecessary conversations. No wasted energy. No external doubt. Just clarity and action. And that is what allows you to move forward with precision, quietly, confidently, without needing to explain every step. Chapter 10. There is one voice you hear more than any other. It doesn't come from outside. It doesn't need permission to speak. It is always there. Your inner voice. The way you talk to yourself. The way you interpret situations. The way you respond internally to what happens around you. Most people are not aware of it. They think their thoughts are just truth, automatic, unquestioned. But this voice is not neutral. It is either building you or breaking you. And for most people, it is working against them, quietly, constantly. It criticizes, it doubts, it predicts failure. You're not ready. This won't work. You always mess this up. And because it sounds like your own voice, you believe it. You don't question it. You accept it as reality. And that shapes everything. Your decisions, your actions, your confidence. Because your inner voice becomes your environment. Even if everything outside is stable, if your internal dialogue is negative, you will feel unstable. This is why mastering your inner voice is one of the most important skills you can develop. Because once you control that, you control your internal state. And when your internal state is strong, external conditions lose power over you. The first step is awareness. You have to start listening, not to change anything yet, just to observe. What are you saying to yourself when things go wrong? What is your immediate reaction when you face difficulty? Do you encourage yourself or criticize yourself? Do you focus on solutions or problems? Most people are surprised when they actually pay attention. They realize their inner voice is harsher than anything they would ever say to someone else. And that creates a problem, because you are living with that voice every single day. It becomes your baseline, your default environment. So if it is negative, you are constantly operating under pressure, constantly doubting, constantly resisting, and that drains energy. It slows progress. It creates hesitation. But the moment you become aware, you create distance. You realize this is a thought, not a fact. And that changes everything. Because now, you can choose. You can question the thought. Is this true? Is this helpful? Is this moving me forward or holding me back? And often, the answer is clear. It is not truth. It is habit. A pattern that has been repeated so many times. It feels real. So the next step is replacing it. Not with unrealistic positivity, not with forced affirmations, but with constructive dialogue. Instead of, I can't do this, you shift to, this is difficult, but I can figure it out. Instead of, I always fail. You shift to, I didn't get the result I wanted. What can I learn? This is not about pretending everything is perfect. It is about shifting your perspective toward growth, toward possibility, toward action. Because your inner voice should function like a coach, not a critic. A coach doesn't ignore mistakes, but they don't destroy confidence either. They guide, they correct, they focus on improvement. And when your inner voice operates that way, everything changes. You recover faster. You stay focused longer. You take action more consistently because you are no longer fighting yourself. Another important distinction is between facts and interpretation. Something happens. You fail. You get rejected. You make a mistake. That is a fact. But what your mind does next is interpretation. This means I'm not good enough. This proves I can't succeed. This shows I should stop. Those are not facts. They are stories. And those stories shape your behavior. If you believe them, you stop. If you question them, you continue. So learning to separate the two is critical because it allows you to respond instead of react. Another powerful skill is self-coaching. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What is the next best move?" Instead of focusing on the problem, you shift to the solution. This keeps you moving because your attention determines your direction. If your attention is on failure, you stay stuck. If your attention is on action, you progress. Your inner voice also affects how you handle pressure. In difficult moments, it either escalates stress or stabilizes you. A negative voice says, "This is too much. You can't handle this." A strong voice says, "Focus. One step at a time. You've handled things before." And that difference determines your performance, not your ability, not your circumstances, but your internal response. Over time, this becomes a pattern, a system, your default way of thinking, and that system either supports you or sabotages you. So you have to be intentional. You have to build it, day by day, thought by thought, because this is one of the few things you fully control. You cannot control outcomes. You cannot control other people. You cannot control everything that happens, but you can control how you speak to yourself about it, and that control is power. Because it shapes your reality. It determines your resilience. It defines your consistency. When your inner voice is strong, you don't need constant external support. You don't need someone else to encourage you. You carry that with you, everywhere. And that makes you independent. Because now, you are never alone. You always have support, internal support, a voice that keeps you grounded, focused, moving forward. And once you build that, you stop being your own obstacle. You become your own advantage. Chapter 11. Most people have goals. Very few have principles. And that difference changes everything. A goal is something you want to achieve. It has an endpoint, a result, a finish line. Lose weight, make money, build something. But once a goal is reached, it can disappear. It can be replaced, forgotten, abandoned. A principle is different. A principle is who you are. It is a standard you follow, regardless of circumstances. It does not depend on outcome. It does not change based on mood. It does not disappear when things get difficult. It remains. And because it remains, it creates consistency. Most people fail, not because they lack goals, but because they lack principles. They act when they feel like it. They adjust when it becomes uncomfortable. They lower their standards when no one is watching. And over time, that inconsistency breaks trust. Not with others, with themselves. Because every time you don't follow through, you reinforce a pattern. I don't do what I say. And that weakens you. It creates doubt, hesitation, lack of confidence. But when you operate from principles, you remove that instability. You don't ask, "Do I feel like it?" You ask, "Is this who I am?" And if the answer is yes, you act. That is power. Because now, your behavior is not dependent on emotion. It is guided by identity. And identity is stable. This is why principles are so important. They define you. Not your achievements, not your results, but your standards. How you act when it's easy. How you act when it's hard. How you act when no one is watching. That is who you are. And once you define that, everything becomes clearer. Decisions become easier. Because you have a filter. Does this align with my principles? If yes, you move. If no, you don't. No confusion, no overthinking, no internal conflict, because the standard is already set. Another important distinction is this: principles are process-based. Goals are outcome-based. You cannot always control outcomes, but you can control your behavior. So when your identity is built on principles, you always have control. Even when results are uncertain, even when things don't go as planned, you still show up. You still execute. You still maintain your standard. And that builds something deeper than success. It builds character. Character is not built in moments of ease. It is built in moments of pressure, when it would be easier to quit, to compromise, to lower your standard. But you don't, because you have decided who you are, and that decision removes negotiation. You don't debate with yourself. You don't justify shortcuts. You don't make excuses. You act in alignment, every time. Of course, you will fail sometimes. You will fall short. You will break your own standard. That is part of the process. But the difference is how you respond. Most people abandon their principles the moment they break them. They say, "I already messed up, so it doesn't matter." And that leads to regression. But when you operate from principles, you return quickly. You don't dwell. You don't spiral. You correct, because your identity is still intact. One mistake does not define you. Your standard does, and that allows you to maintain consistency over time. Another key element of principles is specificity. Vague standards don't work. Be better. Try harder. These mean nothing. They are easy to ignore, easy to justify. But clear principles are different. I finish what I start. I show up every day. I speak honestly. I don't break my commitments. These are measurable, clear, non-negotiable. You know when you follow them. You know when you don't. And that clarity removes ambiguity. It forces accountability, which is necessary for growth. Principles also act as filters for opportunities, for relationships, for decisions. Because not everything that looks good is aligned. Not every opportunity is right for you. Not every relationship supports your growth. And without principles, you say yes to things that pull you off track. But with principles, you are selective. You choose based on alignment, not convenience. And that keeps your direction clear. There is also a deeper benefit: self-respect. When you consistently act in alignment with your own standards, you build trust, not from others, from yourself. You know that you follow through. You know that you stay consistent. You know that you don't compromise easily, and that creates confidence, not based on results, but based on behavior, because results can fluctuate, but your standards remain, and that stability makes you resilient, because even when things go wrong, you don't collapse. You continue, you adjust, you improve, you move forward. Another important aspect is that principles simplify life. Most people struggle with decision-making because they are constantly evaluating, weighing options, considering outcomes, overthinking possibilities. But when you have principles, you eliminate most of that. The decision is already made. You simply follow your standard. And that reduces mental friction. It frees up energy. It allows you to focus on execution instead of endless thinking. But developing principles requires honesty. You have to define what truly matters to you. Not what sounds good, not what others expect, but what you are willing to stand by, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you. Because principles that are only followed when convenient are not principles. They are preferences, and preferences don't create strength. Commitment does. So you choose carefully. You define your standards, and once you define them, you protect them. because they are the foundation of your identity. They determine how you act, how you respond, how you grow, and over time, they shape your life. Because your life is a reflection of your repeated behavior, and your behavior is guided by your principles. So if your principles are strong, your life becomes strong. Not perfect, but consistent, stable, aligned. And that alignment is what allows you to move forward without needing external validation. Because you are no longer asking, "Am I doing enough?" You already know. Because you are living by your own standard. And that is enough. Chapter 12. Most people think independence is built in big moments, major decisions, dramatic changes, bold moves. But that's not where it actually comes from. Independence is built quietly, in small decisions, daily, almost invisible. Because who you are is not defined by what you do once. It is defined by what you do repeatedly. And most of those repetitions happen in moments that seem insignificant. What you choose when no one is watching. How you respond when it would be easier to avoid. Whether you act or delay. These are micro decisions, and they shape everything. Because every small choice sends a signal, a message to yourself. I can handle this. I'll figure it out. I don't need to rely on others for this. Or the opposite. I'll ask someone else. I'll avoid this. I can't do this alone. And over time, those signals become identity. You don't notice it immediately, but slowly, you either build self-sufficiency or reinforce dependency. The people who learn to win alone understand this. They don't wait for big opportunities to prove themselves. They use daily life. Every situation becomes practice, an opportunity to strengthen independence. Before asking for help, they pause. Can I figure this out myself? And most of the time, the answer is yes. But habit pushes them to outsource, to ask, to rely, to defer. So they interrupt that pattern. They try first. They think. They experiment. They solve. And even if they struggle, they gain something valuable. Confidence. Not from success, from effort. Because they proved to themselves that they are capable of handling things. And that builds trust. Another area where this shows up is decision-making. Small, everyday choices. What to do with your time. How to structure your day. What to prioritize. Most people overconsult. They ask others for opinions on things that only affect them, not because they need information, but because they seek reassurance. But every time you do that, you weaken your independence. You train yourself to rely on input. So instead, you start deciding on your own, not perfectly, but intentionally. And with each decision, your confidence grows because you see the outcome. You adjust, you learn, you improve, and that builds your judgment. Another important area is problem solving. Most people react to problems by looking outward. What should I do? Who can help me? What's the answer? But independent thinkers approach it differently. They engage first. They break it down. They explore options. They attempt solutions. And only after that, if needed, they seek input. This builds capability. Because now, you are not dependent on answers. You are generating them. And that changes how you see yourself. You are no longer someone who waits. You are someone who acts. This also applies to emotional situations. When you feel uncomfortable, the instinct is to reach out, to seek comfort, to be reassured. But if you always do that, you never develop emotional strength. So instead, you learn to sit with it, to process it, to understand it, before seeking external support. This builds resilience because now you are not avoiding discomfort. You are learning to handle it. Another subtle area is how you spend your time alone. Most people avoid it. They need stimulation, entertainment, company, because being alone feels empty. But that emptiness is not a problem. It is an opportunity to think, to reflect, to create. So instead of escaping it, you use it. You build the ability to enjoy your own presence. And that reduces dependency, because now you don't need constant external input to feel okay. You are stable, on your own. Self-sufficiency also shows up in practical areas. Taking care of your space, managing your finances, learning new skills. These may seem basic, but they matter, because every skill you develop reduces reliance. Every problem you solve builds confidence. Every task you handle reinforces capability. And over time, this compounds. You become more capable, more resourceful, more independent, not because of one big change, but because of thousands of small ones. Another powerful shift happens when you stop seeking recognition for everything you do. Most people want to share progress, to be seen, to be acknowledged. But when you begin to build internally, you find satisfaction in the process itself. You don't need to announce every step. You don't need validation for every action. You simply do the work, and that builds internal confidence. Because now, your progress is not dependent on being seen. It exists, regardless. This also changes how you communicate. Instead of expecting others to understand you, you express yourself clearly, directly, without relying on hints or assumptions. Because independence includes responsibility. You take ownership of your communication, your needs, your boundaries, your direction, and that creates clarity in your life and in your relationships. Over time, all of these small actions create a powerful effect. You begin to trust yourself, not because someone told you to, but because you have evidence. You've handled situations, you've solved problems, you've made decisions, you've proven that you can. And that proof is what builds real confidence. Not external validation, not temporary success, but repeated experience. And once you have that, you stop doubting yourself, not completely, but enough to move, enough to act, enough to continue, without needing constant reassurance. That is self-sufficiency, not isolation, not rejection of help, but the ability to function without depending on it. And that gives you freedom, because now you engage with others by choice, not by need. You collaborate, but you are not reliant. You connect, but you are not dependent. And that balance is what creates strength, because you are grounded, stable, capable, built not from one moment, but from thousands of small decisions that shaped who you are. Conclusion. At some point, everything becomes simple, not easy, but clear. You stop looking for answers everywhere. You stop waiting for the right moment. You stop hoping something external will finally change your life. Because you understand something most people avoid. Nothing is coming to save you. And instead of feeling heavy, that realization becomes freeing. Because it gives everything back to you. Your direction, your responsibility, your power. You are no longer waiting. You are deciding. You are no longer reacting. You are creating. And that shift changes how you move through life. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need constant motivation. You don't need approval. You move because you've built something internal. A system, a standard, a way of thinking that does not collapse when things get difficult. You've learned how to act without feeling ready, how to continue without being seen, how to trust yourself without constant reassurance. And that makes you different, not louder, not more visible, but more stable. Because your foundation is no longer external. It is within you. You've built the ability to regulate your emotions, to direct your thoughts, to maintain your standards. You've stopped explaining yourself to everyone, stopped chasing approval, stopped depending on motivation. And in place of all that, you've built something stronger. Clarity, discipline, self-trust. These are not things you announce. They are things you live, quietly, consistently. And over time, they shape everything. Your actions become sharper. Your decisions become faster. Your focus becomes stronger. Because you are no longer scattered. You are aligned. You know what matters. You know where you're going. You know how you operate. And that removes hesitation. Not completely, but enough to keep moving. Because hesitation no longer controls you. You act anyway. You continue anyway. You build anyway. That is what it means to win alone. Not isolation, not disconnection, but independence. The ability to move forward without needing constant support, to stay consistent without needing constant motivation, to remain grounded without needing constant validation. And ironically, that is when everything changes. Because when you no longer need the world begins to respond to you differently. Opportunities appear. People notice. Things start to align, not because you chased them, but because you became someone who is ready for them. Someone stable, someone clear, someone reliable. And that attracts results. But by that point, you are no longer dependent on those results. They are not your foundation. They are a byproduct of who you have become. So the question is no longer, will things work out? The question becomes, will you continue, regardless? Because if the answer is yes, then the outcome becomes inevitable. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Because consistency compounds, effort accumulates, identity solidifies, and over time, what once felt difficult becomes natural. You don't have to force yourself anymore. You simply operate. That is the final shift. From trying to being. From effort to identity. From external dependence to internal certainty. And once you reach that point, you don't need to ask if you're on the right path. You feel it. Because everything you do is aligned with who you are becoming. And that is enough. So you move. Quietly. Consistently. Without needing to be seen. Because you understand something deeper. The real transformation was never about the world. It was about you. And now, you are ready.